The blizzard had already swallowed the fence line when Talia Vance refused to let go of the rope, and before that winter ended, 3 brides who'd fled this ranch in less than a week would learn she was the one who stayed. Wind tore across the high pasture like something with teeth, driving snow sideways until the barn was nothing but a gray smear 40 feet off, and the rope biting into her palms was the only thread tying her to a man the whole valley called cursed. Jesse Colter's voice came back to her, broken on the wind. "Hold on, just hold on." And Talia dug her boots into a drift already past her knees and held on anyway, because she hadn't ridden 200 miles to let go the first time the ground turned against her. To understand how a Kansas City widow ended up roped to a stranger in a Wyoming whiteout, the story has to go back 9 days. To the Tuesday afternoon, a stagecoach rattled into Larkspur Hollow, and every soul on Main Street stopped what they were doing to watch it come. They always watched when that particular coach arrived, not because visitors were rare, though they were, but because everyone in town knew exactly what it carried this time. Another bride for Jesse Colter. Odessa Pratt froze mid-sweep outside her boarding house, knuckles gone white around the broom handle. Sheriff Ward Doyle stepped out of his office with his thumbs hooked in his belt, wearing the flat, waiting look he kept for trouble that arrived on schedule. Young Charlie Briggs let his water buckets clatter to the dirt, sloshing half a morning's hauling across his own boots, just to watch the coach door swing open. Larkspur Hollow was the kind of town that grew slow and stubborn against the foot of the Wind River peaks. One long street of clapboard storefronts leaning into a wind that never quite stopped blowing down off the high country, and it kept its stories the way it kept everything else out here, close and well-worn from handling. The town remembered every woman who'd come before her, and it told those stories the way small towns tell every story worth repeating. A little sharper each time, a little more certain of its own version of the truth. Adeline Marsh had lasted 5 days, arriving in spring, wrapped in lace and lavender water with a trunk full of parlor silk, and one look at the ranch house sitting alone in that valley, mountains closing around it like a fist, had cracked something loose in her that never mended. She stopped talking on the 3rd day and started weeping on the 4th. And on the 5th morning, Jesse drove her back to town himself, her hands shaking in sunlight that should have warmed her and didn't. Ruth Callahan had been different, Irish, fierce, certain she could outstubborn the isolation itself. 6 days she lasted, and left worse than Adeline had, shouting at Jesse in the yard loud enough for the ranch hand in the barn to hear every word, then walking the 7 miles back to Larkspur Hollow in the dark, with her feet bleeding through her boots by the time she reached it. Then came Beatrice Lowe, a widow herself, practical and capable, the one the whole town swore would finally hold. 7 days exactly, and she vanished on the 8th morning without a word to anyone, though Odessa would say for years afterward that Beatrice's face, waiting for that departing stage, had looked less frightened than haunted. "I pity whoever's on that coach today." Odessa watched the driver climb down from his perch, broom still gripped tight. Sheriff Doyle's answer carried no real conviction behind it, more habit than belief. Maybe somebody finally told her the truth about Colter. Odessa's laugh came out bitter as spoiled milk. The truth is, his mother was Apache, and his father drank himself into an early grave, and that man out there lives like a ghost who forgot to die. The coach door swung open, and the woman who stepped down was nothing anyone on that street had braced for. Past 30, by the look of her, dressed in practical gray wool already dusted from the trail, dark hair coming loose from a simple knot at her neck. No parasol, no gloves, no trembling excitement or dread in the set of her shoulders. She studied the street the way a surveyor studies land, measuring it rather than fearing it, and when her clear gray eyes landed on the sheriff, she crossed toward him with the unhurried purpose of a woman who had already made every decision that mattered to her. "I'm looking for the Colter ranch. I was told someone would meet me here." Doyle took in the fine lines fanning from her eyes, lines that spoke of grief and laughter both, and understood at once this was no desperate girl fleeing scandal, no romantic fool chasing frontier daydreams. He warned her plainly anyway, the way the town's conscience required of him. 3 women had come before her and left inside a week. "I know all of that. I asked very particular questions before I bought my ticket." Not a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "I'm Talia Vance, formerly of Kansas City, and I'm here to marry Mr. Colter and help run his land. Is he coming, or should I find my own way out there?" Before Doyle could manage a reply, hoofbeats rolled down from the north road, and every head on Main Street turned to watch a single rider cut a dark shape against the low afternoon sun. Jesse Colter rode the way some men only dream about riding, moving with the horse instead of merely sitting atop it. And as he closed the distance, the details sharpened one by one. Tall, lean, a strength built by work rather than leisure, skin the color of copper in high summer, black hair brushing his collar beneath a hat pulled low. It was his face that always unsettled Larkspur Hollow, not because it looked cruel, but because it revealed nothing at all, his mother's high cheekbones set against his father's stubborn jaw, dark eyes as unreadable as well water. He swung down in one fluid motion and simply looked at her for a long, silent moment while the entire street held its breath. "Miss Vance." Low, rough with disuse, more a statement than a greeting. "Mr. Colter." Her hand went out the way a man's would, firm and direct. Something flickered across his face before he shook it once, his palm swallowing hers whole. "Your trunk?" "Just this bag and that crate. I travel light." His eyebrows lifted a fraction. For a man who gave away nothing, that fraction was a shout. They rode out of Larkspur Hollow 20 minutes later, Talia sitting her borrowed horse with an ease that made Odessa shake her head from the porch. 7 days, she muttered, to no one in particular. Same as the last one. Charlie Briggs, 16 and newly romantic about everything, argued the point out loud. But the sheriff only watched the 2 riders shrink toward the mountains and kept his silence, because he'd heard that same hopeful argument 3 times already, and it had never once turned out right. The ride passed in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable so much as watchful, Jesse pointing out a lightning-split pine that marked his property line, a creek that ran year-round, a ridge where mountain lions sometimes denned, and Talia asking only practical questions about water and grazing, never once reaching for the personal ones he'd learned to dread from every woman before her. They climbed steadily as they rode, the trail narrowing between stands of lodgepole pine gone silver dark in the failing light, the air growing thinner and colder with every switchback, until the valley finally opened beneath them like something unclenching. The ranch, when the land finally opened around them, was small but solidly built, timber and stone, a porch angled to catch the morning sun, a good barn beyond it, a corral, a root cellar dug into the hillside. Talia reined in and studied it the way she'd studied the street in town. Good water access, smart barn placement, out of the north wind. You built this yourself. Mostly had help raising the barn. It shows respect for the land, she granted, and dismounted stiffly after the long ride. Where did the others sleep? The bluntness of it caught him flat-footed. The house. I took the barn. We weren't married yet. Practical, she allowed, and started for the porch steps, then turned back to face him squarely, laying the whole arrangement plainly between them, the way she intended every arrangement between them to stay. Two strangers agreeing to bind their lives together for practical reasons. He needed help running a ranch. She needed security and ground to build something on. A business arrangement, and if something more grew out of it over time, that would be to the good. But she believed firmly in saying plain things plainly, because it prevented a great deal of hurt later. Inside, the house was sparse and clean, one main room built around a good stone hearth, two small bedrooms, no curtains, nothing decorative, nothing soft. Talia walked every inch of it, opening cupboards, testing the pump, checking the chimney draw, nodding to herself like a woman taking inventory of her own future. You keep it clean. I was raised to respect the space that shelters me. By your mother. It wasn't really a question so much as room left open for him to answer or not. Yes. She believed cleanliness was a kind of dignity, a way of honoring yourself and the ground under your feet. A wise woman, Talia granted, and asked nothing further, which unsettled him more than curiosity would have. She turned to the cook stove instead. I'll need to know what you keep on hand, what you eat, whether you have preferences. Meat, beans, bread when there's time, coffee. Do you like vegetables? The question was so unexpected he nearly laughed outright. I do, in fact. Good. I'll want a kitchen garden come spring, but I'll need the frost dates and the soil first. Then she stopped and turned to face him fully, and her voice went serious in a way that stilled the whole room. Mr. Colter, I want to be plain about something. I did not come here to be sheltered like some fragile thing kept behind glass. I came here to work. I am strong, I am capable, and I intend to earn my place at this table. If you treat me like a guest, or worse, an ornament, I will leave. Partnership means equals. Can you accept that? Jesse stared at this stranger, standing in his mother's swept-clean house, dust motes drifting gold around her in the low afternoon light, making demands and drawing boundaries like she'd been born to it, and felt something move in his chest he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope, unwelcome and enormous. The others failed because I tried to protect them from the hardest parts of this life. It only made them feel useless, shut out. I've learned from that. Then you've learned something worth learning. Real approval in her voice. I'll make my own mistakes too. When I do, tell me plainly. Don't let it fester into resentment. Agreed. Agreed. Then let's talk about the ranch itself. How many head do you run? They talked past sundown, Jesse sketching property lines in the dust of the table with a rough finger, while Talia asked question after question about the terrain, the herd, the market for beef, the seasonal grind of high country ranching. And he found himself answering more fully than he had spoken to anyone in years. The north pasture floods every spring, you said. Have you tried a drainage channel along the western edge? We had the same trouble on my father's land in Missouri. He hadn't thought of it. When full darkness came, she set her few belongings in the smaller bedroom, some clothes, a few books, a small wooden box she didn't open, and told him plainly what her crate carried. Seeds, basic medicines, tools she'd judged useful. Most women bring more, he ventured. Most women aren't me. Before he retreated to the barn for the night, she stopped him at the door. There's a preacher who passes through twice a month. He'll return in 5 days. That gives us 5 days to see if we can build something before making it legal. That seems reasonable, he allowed. You're very pragmatic. Would you rather I be romantic? I don't know what I'd rather, he confessed, and it was perhaps the most honest sentence he'd spoken to another soul in years. Before she let him go that first night, Talia gave him the truth she felt she owed him. 10 years married to a man Kansas City had considered everything a wife should want: charming, respected, successful, and a liar underneath every layer of it. A man who'd gambled away their whole life and left her nothing but his debts when a stray gunshot in a card room finally ended him. I learned that comfort built on lies is worse than hardship built on truth. Your advertisement was so brutally honest about what you were offering that I knew I'd found something real. Jesse lay awake in the barn loft that night, listening to the ranch settle around him, turning her words over the way he turned an unfamiliar tool in his hands, testing its weight before he trusted it. 3 brides had come with softer words than that, and left him hollowed out regardless. For the first time in longer than he could measure, though, the crushing weight of being alone had lifted, if only a little. One day of plain speaking and clear eyes behind them. 6 more before the preacher came, 6 more before this fragile thing might become something real, and he fell asleep still half afraid to let himself want it. In the house 50 yards off, Talia sat a long while by her own small lamp before she let herself sleep, the sparse bedroom around her smelling faintly of wood smoke and cedar. She had meant every word she'd told Jesse Colter that day, chosen carefully, deliberately, the way she chose everything now that her own judgment had once failed her so badly. But she hadn't told him all of it. She hadn't told him she was afraid, not of him, not of the isolation pressing in against every window, but of failing again, of discovering some new way to be not quite enough. Her husband's death had freed her from a cage built entirely of lies, but it had also cracked her faith in her own eyes, in her own ability to read a man clearly before it cost her everything. Still, she had watched Jesse Colter all day, the care he took with his animals, the honesty in every answer even when the honesty cost him, the way he'd offered up his mother's dress like a piece of himself he rarely let anyone near. That was something. It was more than she'd had walking into her first marriage with her eyes wide shut. 7 days, the town had said. No woman lasted longer than that with him. Talia turned down her lamp and told herself that tomorrow was only day 2, and if she survived all 7, she would have already built something worth defending. Dawn broke cold and rose gold, and Talia was up before first light, coffee already brewing by the time Jesse came in from washing at the pump, his breath still fogging the air. You're up early. So are you. I assumed there was work to be done. He watched her crack eggs into a pan with the unbothered ease of a woman who had fed people her whole life, and thought of Adeline weeping over the absent indoor pump, of Ruth's bitter complaints about primitive conditions, of Beatrice's quiet sigh of resignation at what little there was to work with. Talia simply worked with what stood in front of her. Over breakfast he offered her something of his mother's, a deerskin dress folded away in a storage trunk, softened with age, beaded carefully along the collar and cuffs. "I would be honored to wear it," she said, and meant it plainly. And when she returned wearing it, moving with a freedom no store-bought dress had ever given her, Jesse found himself staring a beat too long, not because she resembled his mother in any way, but because someone was finally treating those clothes with the respect they deserved instead of curiosity or disdain. They rode the north fence line that morning and found nearly 50 yards of it down, posts snapped, wire tangled uselessly where elk had come through ahead of the first hard snow. They worked side by side through the cold, Jesse showing her how to set a post and string wire with enough give to survive a winter's freeze and thaw, Talia learning fast, offering better angles when she saw them, securing a length of wire with an expert twist that made him look twice. "You've done this kind of work before." "Farm work similar enough. My father held land in Missouri before he died, and it's part of why your advertisement appealed to me. City life felt useless, all appearance and empty calls. Out here, what a person does with their hands actually matters." "It matters," he agreed, "though the town doesn't trust me enough to believe I do any of it honestly." "That wasn't a question," she noted evenly, straightening against the wind. "No. My mother's people and my father's people have been at war for generations. Being both makes me neither. Not white enough for the ranchers, not Apache enough for the tribes. Just caught between." "Being between can mean a person understands both sides better than either one alone," she countered, studying him in the hard light. "That isn't weakness. That's wisdom, if a man uses it right. Most people don't see it that way. Most people are fools, and their opinions don't run this ranch. Ours do." That night, over a proper supper, Talia pressed him gently toward the real reason each bride before her had fled, not the isolation itself, but the exact breaking point beneath it. Adeline had left, he realized aloud for the first time, because he'd kept her too separate from the work and the world, and the loneliness of that separation had crushed her days into nothing. Ruth had left because she'd wanted to remake him into someone more acceptable to polite company, and when he refused to be reshaped, her anger had nowhere left to go but at him. Beatrice, he confessed slowly, had almost made it. But in the end she'd been afraid, not of him exactly, but of what a life beside him would cost her standing in every room she might ever enter again. So Adeline needed purpose, Ruth needed you accepted exactly as you are, and Beatrice needed the courage to live outside everyone else's approval. She set down her cup. "And what do you think I lack?" "I don't know what you lack. You seem whole already, which only makes me wonder what you actually need from this." She stood and carried the dishes to the wash basin, her voice steady even as her hands went still over the water. "I need what I already told you, security, purpose, honesty. But I also need to know my contributions matter, that I'm building something lasting instead of maintaining somebody else's vision. Real partnership, Jesse, not chores handed down from above. You'll have that. Will you, though? Sharing control frightens most men. Admitting they don't have every answer frightens them worse. He crossed to stand beside her, taking up a cloth to dry as she washed. I've carried this place alone for 5 years, every decision, every burden. Sharing that weight isn't frightening. It's relief. She glanced sideways at him. You might feel differently the day I disagree with you. Then we'll argue it out and find something that serves us both. That's what partners do. A small, real smile ghosted across her face. You have more faith in that process than I ever had in my first marriage. I'm not your first husband. No, she granted softly. You're not. If a story like this one is keeping you up past your bedtime, take a moment to become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It costs nothing extra to watch, and it means a great deal to a small channel telling stories worth staying for. Day 2 closed with Talia bent over the ranch ledger she'd found in the storage room, correcting his bookkeeping with a pencil and patient precision, tracking expenses and income the way she'd once tracked her father's accounts, and her late husband's too, before she'd discovered exactly which debts he'd been hiding from her. You're doing my books. Partnership means books too. Numbers I understand. Land and cattle I'm still learning. He pulled a chair beside her and watched her build tidy columns out of chaos, caught not just by the figures but by the shape of her mind moving through a problem. Logical, thorough, 3 steps ahead of him always. Why did you really come here, Talia? Not the practical reasons. You could have found security in Kansas City easily enough. She set down the pencil. Because I was suffocating there. Someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then someone's widow. Never simply myself. Every choice weighed against what was proper. Here, the land doesn't care what I wear or whether I hold my tongue. I can be useful in ways that actually matter, and that's worth more than any comfort I left behind. You're running away. Not unkindly. I'm running towards something. There's a difference. Aren't you doing the same, staying on land that ties you to both halves of who you are instead of pretending to be something simpler? He'd never thought of it in quite those terms. I stay because it's mine. I built it. It matters. Exactly. And I came because I wanted something of my own that I helped build too. A week's worth of small routines had already knit itself between them by the time Talia insisted on riding into Larkspur Hollow for salt and coffee before the weather turned any harder. The street went quiet the moment their wagon rolled past the mercantile, the way it always did around Jesse. Women drawing their children a step closer, a rancher near the hitching post, spitting pointedly into the dust. Inside the store, the clerk served them both in a silence with real weight to it, and the mayor's wife found a reason to drift near the counter with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. We do worry about you, taking up with a man like that so far from decent company. Talia met her eyes without blinking. I want for nothing. Can the rest of this town say the same about the people it looks past every single day? The woman's mouth snapped shut, and she retreated in a swirl of taffeta, but not everyone in that store had turned their face away. The blacksmith's wife caught Talia's eye across the aisle and gave the smallest of nods, the kind that cost a person something in a town like this to offer at all, and an old rancher near the door tipped his hat to Jesse on the way out, unhurried, unbothered by who was watching him do it. Larkspur Hollow, it turned out, was not made entirely of the kind who'd come to a person's gate with a torch and a grievance. It only sometimes felt that way, standing in a room gone quiet around you. Day 3 brought a gray sky heavy with the promise of snow, and Talia insisted on riding out to see the herd before the weather turned, reading each animal with a rancher's practiced eye, marking one aging red cow for sale despite Jesse's sentimental attachment, because her hips wouldn't survive another calving season. Sentiment doesn't feed cattle through winter, she reminded him, and he found he couldn't argue with her logic, even as it stung a little to hear it said so plainly. The snow started at midday, light at first, thickening fast, visibility collapsing until the ranch itself seemed to vanish behind a curtain of white. They pushed the horses hard for home, secured the animals as the wind began to howl in earnest, and by the time the door slammed shut behind them, the storm had them sealed inside together, 3 days at least, maybe 4, the valley cut off from everything beyond its own walls. Snow piled against the windows through the afternoon and into the evening, burying the porch rail, erasing the fence line entirely, until the world outside the glass was nothing but a churning gray-white wall, and the only proof the barn still stood at all was the muffled stamp of hooves carrying faintly across the yard between gusts. The small house seemed to shrink as evening fell, and the wind screamed harder around the eaves, both of them sharply aware of the other's presence in a way that felt more intimate, more uncertain than any long day of shared outdoor work had been. Jesse offered to sleep in the barn regardless of the weather. "Don't be ridiculous, you'll freeze. We're both adults. We can share a roof without scandal following us in." After supper, she produced a deck of cards, taught to her by her own mother, and they played late by lamplight, her competitive streak surfacing sharp and sudden, Jessie laughing, a real laugh, rusty from disuse, when she won a hand through pure, clever strategy. "You're ruthless." "Only at cards. In life I try to be fair, but what's the point of playing only to lose?" Between hands they traded pieces of childhood, both of them having lost a parent young, both of them strangers in rooms that should have been home, both valuing competence over charm. "Your mother," Talia said carefully, once the cards were set aside. "You loved her a great deal." "She was everything once my father drank himself into the ground. Fever took her when I was 17. I've been alone since." Talia reached across the table and squeezed his hand once, a simple gesture that landed on him like a brand. "You're not alone now," he tried, aiming for lightness he didn't quite feel. "Not for 3 more days at least." "For longer than that," she said quietly, "if I have anything to say about it." Morning came gray and merciless. Snow drifted halfway up the window panes, and Jesse's face when he looked up from the fire told Talia everything before he spoke a word about it. "It's worse than I thought. Temperature dropped hard overnight. The cattle will be struggling. Can we reach them?" "I can. You should stay here." She was already reaching for the warmest layers she owned. "We've been through this. Partnership means I don't hide indoors while you risk your neck. If the herd needs help, we both go." "This isn't ordinary weather, Talia. People die in storms like this, 10 feet from their own front door." "Then we'll be careful. We'll rope ourselves together if we have to. I won't sit here uselessly while you're out there alone." She wrapped a scarf across her face until only her eyes showed. "Now tell me what needs doing." They roped themselves together with 50 feet of line, Jesse leading, Talia close behind, and the moment they left the porch, the wind struck like a fist, stealing the breath clean out of their lungs. He'd walked this ground to the barn 1,000 times, and could still barely find it now, forced twice to stop and reorient along a guide rope he'd strung years earlier for exactly this kind of storm. Inside the barn, the horses stamped and the milk cow bawled with fear, and over the howling gaps in the roof, Jesse shouted that the cattle needed checking in the near pasture, sheltered behind the ridge if they hadn't scattered already. Then we find them if they have. Talia was already shaking with cold, but her voice stayed steady. This is too dangerous. I move faster alone. And if you fall, if you're hurt, I won't even know which direction you went. She gripped his arm, eyes fierce above the scarf. Stop trying to protect me and let me help. We're wasting daylight arguing. He wanted to send her back. Every instinct in him screamed to keep her safe the way he'd failed to keep the others happy. But the set of her shoulders told him plainly she wouldn't obey the order even if he gave it. Stay close. If I tell you to do something, you do it. No questions. Agreed. They found the first casualty within 20 minutes, a young heifer separated from the herd, frozen stiff behind a boulder she'd tried to shelter against. Talia checked the brand without flinching, without the tears or revulsion he half expected from a woman raised in a parlor. I'll mark her lost when we're back. The practicality of it struck him harder than any grief would have. She understood bone deep that this was simply the cost of ranching in unforgiving country. They found the main herd huddled in the ridge's lee as Jesse had hoped, but drifts had trapped several animals, and frost was forming on frightened muzzles, body heat melting snow that refroze into dangerous ice along their hides. We need to move them, Jesse shouted over the wind, closer to the barn where we can manage them better. It was brutal work, the herd stubborn and terrified, both of them pushing from opposite sides, calling, never panicking when a steer broke loose or a cow turned aggressive with fear, Talia falling twice into deep drifts and climbing back up both times without a word of complaint. By the time the herd was secured in the near paddock, Jesse's face burned raw with windburn, and his hands had gone numb inside his gloves, and Talia moved with the stiff, careful gait of a body running purely on will. Getting back to the house was its own small war against the shifting wind. Jesse forced to stop and search for the guide rope more than once, and for one raw moment real fear cut through his exhaustion. If he lost the path now, they could die within sight of shelter. Then Talia's hand found his through the white chaos and squeezed. Whether giving comfort or seeking it he couldn't say, and somehow that steadied him enough to find the rope again and follow it hand over hand to the blessed solid weight of the porch steps. They stumbled inside and slammed the door against the storm's fury, standing there dripping and too exhausted even to shed their frozen coats. And then Talia started laughing, wild and half hysterical and entirely real. We did it. We actually did it. You're insane, he managed without any real heat behind it. Completely insane. So are you. What kind of man checks on cattle in weather like this? But she was grinning behind her scarf, eyes bright with something that might have been shock or joy or both at once, and despite everything, he found himself laughing too, an actual laugh that startled him more than the storm had. His fingers shook too hard to work his own coat buttons, and without a word, Talia stepped close and did it for him, her own hands barely steadier, and the intimacy of it, her fingers at his collar, ice crystals melting in her hair, should have felt awkward and instead felt necessary. He returned the favor, easing her out of her frozen layers until they both stood shivering, but beginning to thaw before the fire he rebuilt into a roaring blaze. "That was day 4, she said at last, staring into the flames. "The others were long gone by now. Are you counting down to my escape?" "I'm counting forward to a decision, and after today, I think I already know what mine will be." Fear curled through him even as hope did. "You could have died out there. I nearly lost us both coming back. But you didn't. We didn't." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Do you know what I realized today, trusting you to lead us home through that? That this is real. Not some romantic idea of frontier life, not an escape from my past, but actual reality, hard and dangerous, and demanding everything I have. And I want it. This work, this honesty, even when it's brutal." She met his eyes. "I'd rather be tested and alive than comfortable and empty. Today I felt more alive than I have in years." He took her cold, work-roughened hand in his and held it. "I'm glad you stayed. Glad you came out there with me. I couldn't have moved that herd alone." "Partnership," she said softly. "That's what you promised. That's what I promised too." Near 3 in the morning, deep into her watch by the fire, Talia heard a sharp crack over the storm's howl and found by lamplight that a branch had broken loose and struck the barn roof. She woke Jesse instantly, and this time he didn't argue when she pulled on her coat beside him. They fought their way back out into the screaming dark and found snow already sifting through a torn section of roof. The animals panicked in their stalls and spent 2 brutal hours by lantern light shoring up the damage and moving stock to the dry side of the barn, every motion a battle against cold that wanted to steal the feeling from their limbs entirely. Back inside, as gray dawn finally pressed against the storm, they collapsed near the hearth, Talia's hands shaking too hard to hold her own coffee cup until Jesse set it aside and warmed her fingers between his own. "This is day 5, she said through chattering teeth. The others were gone by now. Do you want me to be?" "No," he told her plainly. "I want to finish what we started. The fence line, the supply inventory, that barn roof needing proper repair, all of it." "All of it," he repeated, understanding she meant far more than chores. "I'm staying, Jesse. When the preacher comes, I intend to marry you. Not because I've nowhere else to go, but because in 5 days of hard truth and harder work, I found more purpose here than I found in 10 comfortable years anywhere else." He should have felt only relief. Instead, fear curled cold through his gut. "You've been through something today that would shake anybody. You're exhausted." "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have." She gripped his hand back, holding on. "I know myself, Jesse. I know exactly what I can sustain, and I can sustain this. I want to sustain this. And if you're wrong, if in a year you look around and realize you've made a mistake you can't take back, then I'll have chosen it with my eyes wide open, which is more than I can say for the marriage I already survived once. I'm not asking you for guarantees. I'm asking you to let me choose you the way you're choosing to let me stay." Long after she'd gone to bed that night, Jesse sat by the dying fire, turning the whole conversation over in his mind, hunting for the crack in it the way he'd hunt a fence line for the one post about to give way, and found none. That frightened him more than the blizzard had.
Hope had failed him 3 times already, and each failure had carved something out of him, left him a little more hollow. If he didn't let himself hope for everything, maybe he wouldn't be destroyed when it didn't come. But despite every ounce of his own caution, he felt the hope anyway, fragile and dangerous, and he let it sit there unspoken until sleep finally took him. The storm broke on the 6th morning, sun cutting hard and blinding off snow-banked chest-deep against every fence post on the property, the whole valley gone silent and white and strangely beautiful now that it had stopped trying to kill them. Icicles as long as a forearm hung from the barn eaves, catching the light like glass, and the world beyond the porch steps looked scrubbed clean, remade overnight.
They spent that whole day and most of the next simply digging out, shoveling a path from house to barn, hauling feed through drifts that swallowed a man to the thigh, splinting the torn section of roof properly this time with lumber Jesse had been saving for a project he'd never quite gotten around to. Talia worked without complaint through blistered palms, wrapping them at night in strips of clean cloth, and refusing to slow down the next morning regardless. And by the 2nd evening, the ranch stood set to rights again, animals fed and sheltered, fences mended, the 2 of them moving around each other with an ease that no longer needed explaining, the wordless shorthand of 2 people who had already survived the worst a season could offer them. The preacher's wagon came up the north road on the 7th afternoon, exactly as promised, and half of Larkspur Hollow rode out behind it. Curiosity and cold weather be damned, because word had already crossed the valley that this particular bride had lasted through the worst blizzard in 3 winters and hadn't so much as blinked. Odessa arrived with a jar of preserves and tears she pretended weren't there. Sheriff Doyle stood at the back with his hat in his hands, watching a woman he'd been certain would come limping back to town inside the week instead, standing steady on Jesse's porch in a deerskin dress that had once belonged to his mother, beaded cuffs catching the winter light. Talia said her vows plainly, the same way she'd said everything else since stepping off that coach, and when Jesse slid a plain band onto her finger, his hands, steady through a blizzard and a broken barn roof, shook harder than they had through either. Charlie Briggs cried without shame at the back of the small crowd, and even the old rancher who'd tipped his hat outside the mercantile stayed for the modest meal afterward, raising a cup to a marriage half the valley had bet against only a week before. Someone had strung dried wildflowers along the porch rail, and the preacher's own wife had baked a plain white cake that vanished within the hour, and for one afternoon the ranch that had swallowed 3 brides whole stood full of neighbors instead, laughter carrying out over snow still banked waist-high beyond the yard. Odessa pressed a jar of preserves into Talia's hands at the door and told her, voice thick, that she'd never once been so glad to lose a bet in her life. By the time the last wagon rolled back down the north road toward town, the light was fading gold over the mountains, and Jesse Colter stood on his own porch with his wife beside him, watching his ranch empty out again into quiet. Only this time the quiet held no loneliness in it at all. Before the last hard freeze of that first winter closes out this story, take a moment to become a channel member and tap Join beside the channel name. It helps keep stories like Talia and Jesse's coming to a small channel that's grateful you stayed until the end. A year and a half wore on, seasons folding one into another, the ranch prospering under two sets of hands instead of one. Jesse's knowledge of land and livestock, braided together with Talia's head for numbers and her stubborn refusal to let a good idea go unexamined. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid him began stopping by instead. The Briggs boys trading an afternoon's heavy labor for a slice of Talia's cooking, Odessa turning up weekly with news from town and a fondness for the whole household that had crept up on her without permission. The ranch itself grew busier by the season, new fence lines rising faster than the old ones needed mending, a proper kitchen garden pushing green shoots through soil. Talia had tested twice before ever trusting a seed to it. The north pasture drained at last exactly the way she'd first sketched it in the dust of that kitchen table. The whispers in town never disappeared entirely. Small places keep their stories the way a miser keeps coin, spending them out slowly over years, but they change shape as the seasons turn, skepticism softening by degrees into something closer to respect. Even the mayor's wife, the same woman who'd once wondered aloud at the mercantile counter what Talia really wanted with another man's household, took to nodding politely from her buggy whenever the Colter wagon rolled past. The old suspicion worn down at last by nothing more dramatic than two people simply continuing to show up for each other, season after season, in plain sight of a town that had expected otherwise. By the following autumn, a daughter had joined them, small and dark-eyed, named Nora, and the whole valley that had once counted down Talia's days now counted up the months since anyone had last called Jesse Colter a curse to his face. He carried his daughter out to the corral most evenings and named the horses for her one by one, watching Talia watch them both from the porch, with an expression that still caught him off guard, soft in a way nothing about that first hard week had promised him. Sheriff Doyle found him at Nora's first birthday gathering, hat in hand, unusually serious. "I owe you an apology I should have given years ago. I judged you on your blood and your isolation both, and I was wrong. You're one of the better men in this valley, and Talia saw that from the first afternoon. Took the rest of us considerably longer." "Thank you for saying it," Jesse said, "and for the chance to prove it. You proved a good deal more than that." Doyle's gaze drifted to where Talia stood laughing with a knot of ranch wives, Nora balanced on her hip. "You proved what's possible when people bother to look past the surface of a thing." The second winter came harder than the first, though neither of them said so out loud, both of them too busy meeting it head-on to spend much breath on comparisons. Jesse taught Talia to read the sky the way his mother had once taught him, the particular green-gray cast of cloud that meant a bad storm was still a full day off, the way the horses grew restless hours before the wind ever picked up. Talia taught him, in turn, patience with numbers he'd never had patience for before her, and together they weathered two more hard freezes without losing a single head of stock, the north pasture drainage holding exactly as she'd promised it would the first night she'd sketched it into the dust of his kitchen table. That night, with Nora asleep in her cradle and the ranch settled quiet around them, Jesse and Talia sat together on the porch and watched stars gather over the valley he'd once believed he was destined to work alone forever. "A year and a half ago, I stepped off a coach in this valley thinking I was taking a calculated risk on a practical arrangement." She turned her face toward the last of the fading light. I had no notion I was actually coming home. You made it a home by choosing to stay, to work, to build. This place was only a ranch before you. We made it a home together. That's the whole of it, isn't it? That together we built something neither of us could have managed alone. He laced his rough fingers through hers. The 7 days everyone in town was so sure would break you. Do you remember what you were thinking, deciding to stay? I remember thinking you were the first person in years who saw me clearly and valued exactly what he saw. That the work was hard, but it was honest, and building something real was worth any difficulty it cost me. She turned to face him fully, gray eyes catching starlight. I'd rather have had 1 true year with you than a lifetime of comfortable lies with any other man alive. I choose you again, Jesse. Every single time. He kissed her then, slow and certain, pouring into it every word his own quiet nature had never quite learned how to say aloud. And when they finally drew apart, she was smiling in the firelight spilling faintly through the window behind them. 3 women had come to this ranch before Talia Vance, and 3 women had fled it inside a week, exactly as the whole valley had expected. But Talia had stayed, not because she had merely endured Jesse Colter, but because together, day by brutal, honest day, they had built a life worth staying for, a home standing solid against every winter still to come, and proof enough that the hardest true thing a person could build would always outlast the easiest lie a person could tell.